Hygiene among medieval peasants was not defined by ignorance or indifference. It was defined by limitation. To understand how clean medieval peasants were, you must first abandon modern assumptions. Cleanliness in the Middle Ages did not mean sterility, daily showers, or perfumed soap. It meant something far more practical: removing visible dirt, reducing discomfort, and avoiding illness when possible. Hygiene was shaped not by ideals, but by access to water, time, fuel, and privacy. Most peasants lived close to the land they worked. Their bodies were tools, exposed daily to soil, animals, sweat, and weather. Dirt was unavoidable. Mud clung to clothing and skin. Manure fertilized fields and stained hands. Smoke from hearth fires settled into hair and fabric. Cleanliness was temporary by nature. No amount of effort could keep a working body pristine for long. Water was central but not always abundant. Rivers, streams, wells, and rainwater were primary sources. Bathing was not unknown. It was simply infrequent. Heating water required firewood, which was precious. Time spent bathing was time not spent working. Full-body baths were usually reserved for special occasions, seasonal changes, or illness. More common was partial washing hands, face, feet done daily or near daily when water allowed. Wooden tubs existed in peasant homes, but they were multi-purpose objects. The same tub might be used for washing clothes, soaking grain, bathing children, or scrubbing bodies one after another. Water was reused. Cleanliness was relative. Bathing was communal within families, not private, and certainly not luxurious. Soap did exist. Contrary to popular myth, medieval people were not unfamiliar with it. Soap was made from animal fat and ash, crude but effective. It was harsh on skin and scarce. Peasants used it sparingly, often reserving it for laundry rather than bodies. Washing with plain water was far more common. Clothing played a major role in hygiene. Linen undergarments absorbed sweat and oils from the skin. These were washed more frequently than outer garments, which were heavier and harder to clean. Changing linen was considered a form of cleanliness. A peasant might wear the same outer clothing for days or weeks, but clean underlayers reduced odor and irritation. Hair care followed similar logic. Hair was washed occasionally with water, herbs, or lye solutions. Combs were essential tools not for vanity, but for removing dirt, debris, and parasites. Lice were common, especially in winter when bathing decreased. Delousing was routine, accepted, and communal. It was not shameful. It was maintenance. Teeth were not ignored. While toothbrushes did not exist, people cleaned their teeth using cloth, sticks, salt, or herbs. Dental disease was common, but not universal. Diet mattered more than hygiene. Peasants ate less sugar than later populations, which reduced certain forms of decay. Smell was understood differently. Body odor was expected in a working population. What mattered was excess stench associated with illness, rot, or neglect. Strong smells were masked with herbs when possible. Lavender, rosemary, and other plants were used not only for scent, but because they were believed to ward off disease. Disease shaped hygiene beliefs deeply. Medieval people did not understand germs, but they recognized patterns. Filth was associated with sickness. Bad air miasma was feared. As a result, cleaning living spaces mattered. Floors were swept. Waste was removed when possible. Animals were kept separate from sleeping areas if space allowed. These practices were inconsistent, but intentional. Seasonality mattered. In summer, bathing increased due to heat and access to water. In winter, it decreased dramatically. Cold made washing dangerous. Wet skin invited illness. Staying dry and warm mattered more than cleanliness. This trade-off was rational, not ignorant. Public bathhouses existed in towns and cities, though peasants used them less frequently than artisans or merchants. When used, they were social spaces. Bathing was not private or sexual by default, it was communal and practical. These bathhouses declined later due to disease fears, not because people suddenly stopped caring about hygiene. Children were washed more often than adults. Dirt on children was tolerated, but illness was feared. Mothers cleaned infants carefully. Child mortality shaped this attention. Cleanliness was a protective instinct long before it was a scientific one. What medieval peasants lacked was not concern for hygiene but consistency and control. Cleanliness was something achieved briefly, then lost again through labor. It was a cycle, not a state. They did not live in permanent filth. They lived in a world where cleanliness had to compete with survival, and survival always came first. This is where the truth of medieval hygiene begins, not with neglect, but with compromise. Daily hygiene for medieval peasants was shaped as much by habit as by hardship. Cleanliness was woven into routine tasks rather than separated as a special activity. Washing happened alongside work at streams after labor, with leftover water from cooking, during seasonal pauses when fields rested. Hygiene was practical, not ceremonial. Hands were washed often. This mattered because hands touched everything: food, tools, animals, children. Even without germ theory, peasants understood that dirty hands brought sickness. Before eating, kneading dough, or tending wounds, water was used when available. In this sense, hygiene was task-oriented. Certain actions demanded cleanliness. Others tolerated dirt. Feet received attention for the same reason. Long days in wet fields caused sores, infections, and rot. Washing and drying feet reduced pain and kept people mobile. Mobility was survival. A peasant unable to walk could not work, and inability to work was catastrophic. Hygiene served function before comfort. Homes reflected similar logic. Peasant houses were small, crowded, and smoky, but they were not left entirely unmanaged. Floors were swept regularly. Rushes or straw were replaced. Ash from fires was spread deliberately, both to absorb moisture and mask odor. Waste disposal was imperfect, but intentional. Filth was not ignored, it was managed with the tools available. Animals complicated everything. Livestock shared space with humans in many regions, especially in winter. This increased dirt and disease risk, but it also provided warmth and security. Peasants balanced hygiene against necessity. Separation was ideal, but not always possible. Where animals slept close, cleaning increased to compensate. Illness changed priorities immediately. When someone fell sick, washing became more urgent. Clothes were cleaned. Bedding was aired. Herbs were burned. Windows were opened despite cold. These actions were driven by observation, not theory. People noticed that sickness spread in dirty, stagnant spaces. Cleanliness became defense. Religious belief reinforced hygiene in subtle ways. Cleanliness was associated with moral order. Washing before church mattered. Clean clothing on holy days mattered. This did not produce modern hygiene standards, but it created rhythm weekly moments where bodies and clothes were cleaned more thoroughly than usual. Bathing carried mixed meanings. It was healthy, but excessive bathing was sometimes viewed with suspicion. Warm water opened pores, which medieval medicine believed could invite disease. Moderation was encouraged. Balance mattered more than frequency. Peasants followed this logic carefully, especially in colder climates. Public perception of peasant hygiene was shaped by class bias. Elites described peasants as dirty to reinforce hierarchy. Dirt became moralized. Yet archaeological evidence tells a more complex story. Combs, wash basins, soap residues, and grooming tools appear even in poor households. These were not symbols of luxury. They were necessities. Death rituals also reveal hygiene awareness. Bodies were washed before burial. This was done with care and intention, even among the poorest. Cleanliness marked dignity. It was a final act of respect. A society that washed its dead did not ignore hygiene among the living. Children learned hygiene early, not through instruction, but imitation. Washing, delousing, changing linen, sweeping floors, these acts were part of daily life. They were taught as habits, not lessons. This generational transfer mattered more than written knowledge. The greatest threat to hygiene was not ignorance, but disruption. War, famine, displacement, these destroyed routines. Refugees lost access to water and shelter. Camps spread disease. In these moments, medieval hygiene collapsed not because people stopped caring, but because systems failed. What emerges is not a picture of filth, but of constraint. Medieval peasants understood cleanliness within their world. They washed when they could. They cleaned what mattered most. They accepted dirt where it could not be avoided. Hygiene was adaptive, not absent. They did not live clean lives by modern standards, but they did not live careless ones either. And this distinction matters because it reveals a population constantly negotiating between body, labor, environment, and survival. Cleanliness was never an ideal. It was a strategy. As peasants aged, hygiene became harder not because concern faded, but because the body weakened. Ending to fetch water hurt more. Cold soaked into joints longer. Cuts healed slower. Washing, which once refreshed, became painful. Yet even then, routines persisted. Elderly peasants washed selectively, conserving strength for what mattered most: hands, face, wounds. Cleanliness adapted again, shaped by endurance rather than habit. Illness revealed the limits of medieval hygiene most clearly. When plague, fever, or dysentery struck, no amount of washing could stop it. Entire villages were overwhelmed. Water sources became contaminated. Care collapsed under fear. In these moments, medieval hygiene did not fail because it was primitive but because it was powerless against forces no one yet understood. The effort remained. The results did not. What modern observers often mistake for filth was, in reality, exposure. Peasants lived outdoors, worked with animals, and existed in constant contact with soil. Their bodies reflected their environment. Cleanliness did not mean separation from nature, it meant managing proximity to it. Dirt was not the enemy. Decay was. Smell followed the same logic. Strong odors were tolerated if they came from work. They were not tolerated if they came from rot, illness, or neglect. This distinction mattered deeply. A laborer smelled of sweat. A sick body smelled wrong. Medieval people recognized this intuitively, long before medicine could explain it. When peasants traveled to markets, fairs, or pilgrimages, hygiene changed temporarily. Washing increased. Clothes were cleaned. Appearance mattered in public spaces. Cleanliness became social currency. This shows intent. People cleaned themselves when it counted most. Archaeology continues to dismantle the myth of universal medieval filth. Finds include combs worn smooth from use, basins repaired repeatedly rather than discarded, linen fragments showing regular washing. These objects tell a quiet story. Cleanliness was valued enough to be maintained even when resources were scarce. What peasants lacked was infrastructure. No plumbing, no sewage systems, no reliable access to heated water. Hygiene existed within those constraints. Judging it by modern standards misunderstands both eras. The idea that medieval peasants were indifferent to cleanliness survives because it comforts modern superiority. But the reality is more uncomfortable. They worked harder for less cleanliness than most people today and still tried. Their hygiene was not lazy. It was strategic. It focused on what preserved health, mobility, and dignity in a life shaped by labor. Washing when possible, cleaning what mattered, accepting dirt where it was inevitable. In the end, medieval peasant hygiene was not about purity. It was about endurance, keeping the body functional long enough to work, eat, raise children, and survive another season. And in a world where survival was never guaranteed, that was not negligence. It was wisdom.